Hello and welcome to episode 14 of the Insider's Guide to Project Cars 2, where today we're going to take a look at the next step in the tuning setup menu, and that is the suspension tab. Now we're just going to load up the default stable setup that comes with the BMW M6, so all the values that you'll see here on the suspension tab are the default values for this stable setup that comes with the car and comes with the game. Now we're going to go through this screen, take a look at the various different aspects, explain what each one is, what they do, and how you want to adjust and tune them for various different types of tracks and various different types of scenarios. Now this is where things are going to start getting a little bit more interesting. They start to have a bigger impact on the car's overall handling. So you want to think a bit more of the wider, bigger picture rather than adjusting these various different aspects individually, as it will probably require some finer tuning in other areas of the car setup as well. But for today, we are just going to take a look at the suspension tab that is here in this screen and on the screen present in front of you. So we're going to start off with this first option here, which is the steering ratio, and what that effectively is the number of degrees of steering wheel movement that will be required for 1 degree of front wheel rotation in order to turn the wheels of the car left or right. So having a higher steering ratio will require more steering input in order to turn the wheels left or right, and basically what this does is allows you to be a little bit more accurate and have finer control of your steering inputs. So it's quite good for tracks that are faster, higher speed, more open and more flowing, whereas having a lower steering ratio will allow you to turn the wheels left to right a lot quicker with less steering input, and generally they work really well on tracks that are obviously quite tight and quite twisty, have a lot of chicanes where you're having to dart in and out of curbs and things like that. So that is something that you can adjust on the car. Obviously lower steering ratio, like I just said, will give you more sensitive steering, therefore less steering effort in order to turn the wheels of the car left or right, whereas increasing the steering ratio will allow you to have finer control over your steering inputs and place the car a little bit more accurately. So it depends on the actual track and your own personal preference as to which way you'd like to go with the steering ratio. Personally, for myself, I generally find the default of 15.0 to 1 works quite nicely for me. I haven't had really any issues with it. On a couple of slightly tighter tracks, I may have dropped it down to 14.5. Maybe 14.0, but I haven't really gone too much further than that, and I haven't really explored steering ratios too much, but it can be something that is quite useful and just a nice little bit of finer adjustment to the car setup. Now the next option is the toe-in angle, and what this effectively is if you're looking at the car from a top-down bird's eye view, it'll basically be the amount of angle that the tires point in towards the center of the car, and that is the front leading edge of the tires. The diagram there on the screen should indicate that quite nicely in terms of what I mean when it comes to toe in. But having a more positive toe in, i.e. the tires pointing in towards each other, so increasing the value here will generate more scrub when going down the straights, but will give you much better straight line stability, but you will lose out on responsiveness with that as well. Basically what it does, it will generate more force as obviously the tires are pointing in towards each other. It will also produce more heat as the tires are effectively scrubbing along the surface and producing a bit more friction, so it may be slightly detrimental to straight line speeds. But obviously if you are struggling to build the heat up into the tires and get them up to temperature and maintaining temperature, it may be beneficial to take a look at your toe-in angle and possibly increasing it to generate that little bit of heat. Obviously on the flip side of that, if you are struggling to keep your tires cool, you may want to reduce the amount of toe-in angle, as that may help a little bit in order to bring the temperatures down, as obviously there's less scrubbing, but it will also improve responsiveness with the car as well. So using negative toe in, so basically having the tires point outwards away from the center of the car, or should I say the front leading edge of the tire pointing outwards from the center of the car, will improve in the responsiveness and allow you to turn into corners quicker, but obviously that will then affect the straight line stability as well. So bear this in mind. Obviously having it at 0 will pretty much have the tyres dead straight and not pointing in or out away from the center of the car, and obviously with that you'll get a lot less friction. You'll have slightly better straight line speeds, but also reduce the tyre temperatures and also obviously tyre wear, because if you are scrubbing the wheels across the surface of the track with having either a lot of toe in angle or a lot of toe out angle, you'll be generating obviously that heat, and the tyres will be scrubbing across the surface and wearing away at the tyres. So that will increase tyre wear. Obviously having it more straight will also decrease tyre wear as well. So there's a couple of things that you can adjust and fine tune there. Obviously temperatures is a good thing. Obviously how responsive the car is handling. Likewise, obviously adjusting the toe in angle at the rear will obviously affect the rear, whereas the obviously adjusting the toe angle at the front will obviously adjust how the front of the car behaves. So they can be tuned and adjusted separately and individually from each other. But yeah, there's a good thing for adjusting for things for like the tyre temperatures, the amount of tyre wear, and also the responsiveness of the car, and also straight line stability. Now the next option is anti-roll bars, and these are pretty good for adjusting and affecting the overall balance of the car, and whether it leans more towards an aerodynamic grip based setup or a mechanical grip based setup. Effectively what these do is they control how much the car leans from left to right when going through the corner. So obviously if you go into a right-handed turn, the car is going to lean towards the left-hand side and press down onto the tyres on the left-hand side of the car. Having stiffer anti-roll bars will reduce the amount of lean that it will produce and keep the car more level and more flat, which will produce more aerodynamic grip. It's better to have a more stable platform when it comes towards aerodynamics, whereas softening the anti-roll bar will increase the amount of lean and actually lean onto the tyre more, and it will also produce more mechanical grip. Now obviously you've got the options here for adjusting the anti-roll bars at both the front and also the rear of the car, so you can adjust those independently, but having those stiffer setups will give you more steering responsiveness upon initial turning. Obviously for high speed corners it's generally better, or should I say high speed tracks where the track is smoother, you've got a lot more flowing turns and you're more relying on aerodynamic grip. It's better to have a stiffer anti-roll bar, whereas having a softer anti-roll bar is probably better for tighter and twistier circuits where you don't really get up to speed all that much, but you need that good mechanical grip. Now GT3 cars tend to have pretty good mechanical grip as they are anyway. Their tyres are pretty good. There's not a huge amount of aero grip, but you can balance this and basically change how much oversteer and understeer there are in certain types of corners. So if you're finding that you're getting quite a lot of oversteer in slow speed corners, you want to take a look at the rear anti-roll bar and potentially softening that up a little bit more to give you a little bit more mechanical grip. Likewise, if you're actually getting oversteer in high speed corners, you may actually want to stiffen the rear anti-roll bar and make it a little bit more planted. It'll produce a little bit better aero grip at the rear of the car, and it'll probably help support the rear of the car a little bit better and produce less roll and not overpower the tyres quite so heavily. Obviously with the anti-roll bar at the front, obviously increasing or sharpening up, or shall I say, yeah, increasing the anti-roll bar stiffness will give you better steering reaction, however it will cost you mid-corner. And obviously the opposite to that is for the slow speed corners, having more mechanical grip with a softer anti-roll bar setting and higher lean, or shall I say more lean from the car, will give you better mechanical grip. Now you'll want to take a look at the anti-roll bars and adjust them with the camber angles as well, which we'll get to in a moment slightly later on in the episode, as of obviously changing your anti-roll bars and the overall stiffness will affect how much the car actually leans onto those tyres and how much it pushes the tyre over with the camber angle. So this is something that you'll need to keep in mind and not just adjust on its own. Obviously if you go and make a number of camber angle adjustments, and then you go make a bunch of anti-roll bar adjustments, it'll be worth revisiting the camber angle as well, just to make sure that you're fine-tuning that contact patch, which we'll get to and talk to in just a moment. So those are the anti-roll bars. Obviously, having a softer rear will allow the car to be slightly more understeery. Likewise, having a stiffer rear will make it more oversteery. Generally, you kind of want to adjust the front and also the rear in unison as well, in order to not upset the actual balance of the car. And yeah, it kind of depends on what it is you're actually after in the actual type of track. When it comes to weather conditions and things like that, it may be beneficial to soften up the anti-roll bar on the front to give you a little bit better mechanical grip, but also decrease the anti-roll bar slightly, but try and keep some of the stiffness a little bit, to try and get a little bit more oversteer. Generally what people tend to do in wet weather conditions is they think that they need basically good mechanical grip for obviously the wet conditions. You've got less grip overall, you're not going to be producing as much load, but with that actually comes more understeer. So if you go for a setup that's slightly biased towards oversteer, it will help you get turned into the corners a little bit better, and it will actually give you some decent results in terms of lap times in wet weather conditions. Obviously, if you go too far towards oversteer, your car is just going to oversteer. It's going to be all over the place. You're going to have no grip on the rear of the car, and you'll be struggling in those wet conditions. So it's all about the fine balance and trying to find what suits you, what suits the car, the track, and also the conditions. So it may require a little bit of fiddling, but hopefully that will give you a decent idea as to what anti-roll bars are all about. Now, below the anti-roll bars is actually the third spring option, and it can't be adjusted here on the BMW M6 GT3 car. However, it can be adjusted in a number of the high-end open wheel cars. So obviously your Formula X, your Formula A, the Indy cars, probably the Formula Renault 3.5 has it as well, maybe even the Formula C, and then your high-end prototypes, so your LMP1, your LMP2, and your LMP3 should allow you for adjustment of the third spring as well. So generally you will tend to find them in high downforce cars, and what the third spring effectively does is it controls the vertical chassis movement of the car, and basically control the suspension compression either through driver input, the airflow flowing over the car and producing downforce, or alternatively the bumps on the track as well. And yeah, you can basically adjust this with going a more stiffer third spring will lean more towards aerodynamic grip, and it will produce a more stable aerodynamic platform, and obviously make the aerodynamics on the car more effective in those medium and high speed corners. However, it will reduce mechanical grip. Obviously, if you go and soften the third spring, that will give you more mechanical grip, but then you also actually be producing more suspension movement. Therefore, your aerodynamics won't be quite as good, as they'll be moving around an awful lot, and it can also potentially increase the chance of bottoming out the car as well. So fine-tune those depending on the actual track type. Obviously, faster, much smoother tracks will probably benefit from a stiffer third spring, whereas tighter and possibly slightly more bumpy tracks where you need that mechanical grip will probably benefit from having a softer third spring. However, you don't want to go so far that the car is moving around too much and actually starting to bottom out. So that is basically what the third spring does, and maybe of some use to you when you come to testing out those cars and adjusting their tuning setups. Now, moving across to the caster angle, what this effectively is, as the diagram on the screen shows, is basically effectively how far back the suspension leans from the tyre up towards the chassis. One really good way of explaining caster angle is effectively taking two motorbikes. If we say take a sports bike and then we go and take an American chopper, a sports bike will have a much lower caster angle than an American chopper, whereas obviously with obviously the American choppers, you've seen them in videos, pictures. Obviously, if you live over in the US, you probably see them on regular daily occurrence. But the front wheel generally tends to be extended further out and away from the front of the chassis of the bike, and that is basically a greater caster angle than what a sports bike has, where the front tire is a lot closer and hugged in tighter towards the front of the chassis of the bike, and the suspension from the wheel going, or should I say from the wheel angle going up to the handlebars in the chassis is in a much more vertical position. Now, as it says here in the help text, basically having a more positive caster angle will give you better straight line stability. However, it will also increase the wheel weight when turning into the corner, so that the steering wheel will feel heavier with a higher caster angle, and the maximum value is 8.4 here in the BMW M6 GT3. The default is 7.9, but actually decreasing the caster angle will decrease your straight line stability, but make the wheel feel lighter, and actually also increase turn-in responsiveness. Now, generally what you'll tend to find is you want that good initial turn-in, but if the front tyres are basically overpowering the rear tyres, so as soon as you turn in, you get quite a bit of oversteer. However, you're not getting oversteer through the mid-corner or through the exit of the corner. It could very well potentially be due to your cast angle and that being too shallow, and the front tyres are effectively overpowering the front. So if you are getting that really good initial turn-in bite, but it's a little bit too much for the front tyres, it may actually be beneficial to adjust the caster angle and actually increase it a little bit. But obviously, as I said earlier, it will increase the steering weight as well, and it will reduce the responsiveness a little bit. So that's something that you can fine-tune there. It's something that I haven't really personally fiddled around with too much myself, but it can be quite useful on tracks that are tighter and twister. Obviously, having a shallower caster angle will mean that the car's a lot more responsive. You can dart in and around through the corners and through the curbs a little bit quicker, so it'll be more beneficial on those tighter, twistier circuits, whereas a more open and flowing circuit may benefit from a slightly more increased caster angle. Now, next up is camber angle. We actually touched base with this back on the telemetry HUD view Insider's Guide episode that I did a couple of weeks ago. And effectively, what you want to be doing with camber angle is maximizing the contact patch between the road surface and also the surface of the tire. Now, camber angle actually refers to the angle at which the tires lean in towards the center of the car, as demonstrated on the diagram here on the screen in front of you. Now, like I said, you want to be maximizing that contact patch, and you want to be doing it mainly through the corners. So the greater that contact patch is when going through a turn, the more grip that you'll have available to you, the more cornering power that you'll have. So for tracks that have quite high load corners, where there's quite a lot of load being pushed onto the tyre and you kind of roll across the tyre a lot more, for tracks that are a lot more twistier with a lot of high speed flowing corners, you want to have quite high camber angles, as that will give you a better performance when it comes to cornering grip. However, when you increase camber angle, what you're doing is increasing, or shall I say decreasing, the amount of contact patch on the inside leading edge of the tyre that's closest to the center of the car, and it will also lift up those outer thirds from the tyre surface when you're going in a straight line, so that will decrease your braking performance. If you were to decrease your camber angle and have the tyre flatter, you'll increase your contact patch when going in a straight line, which will obviously increase rolling resistance, which will have a bit of an effect on straight line speed, but it will also actually increase your braking performance. You'll be able to brake in a shorter distance with a lower camber angle than you would with a higher camber angle. So you need to balance it a little bit, but generally what you want to be doing is aiming for the temperature range of 5 to 10 degrees from the inside third of the tire and across the tire surface to the outer third that you can see on the telemetry HUD screen. If you get that 5 to degrees difference across the surface of the tyre, generally you're in a pretty good spot when it comes to the camber angles, and you should be able to feel it as well in the car when going through the tunnels. You should have quite good cornering grip, and the car should feel pretty good. Now, one of the other benefits to actually reducing the camber angle, especially on the rear, is actually increasing your acceleration and allowing you to get out to possibly even a higher top speed. Obviously, even though the rolling resistance will be increased from having a lower camber angle, there's actually less pressure on the inside tyre sidewall, and there'll be more energy being transferred through the tyre into the track surface, which will then increase the actual acceleration, and it'll allow you to get to that higher top speed and negate that rolling resistance. And obviously it also then help with your braking as well. So for tracks like Monza, possibly also Le Mans, it could be possibly beneficial to actually run lower camber angles to try and get that straight line speed performance. Obviously that will then be detrimental to your cornering performance as well, so you need to balance that with those kind of corners, and also the actual weather conditions as well. In wet conditions, you're going to be producing less load through the tyres than you would with dry conditions, therefore you're producing less G's, and generally the car won't roll as much onto the tyre as much and push the contact patch down and increase that contact patch with the higher camber angle in those wet conditions. So what you'll want to do is possibly even drop the camber angle a little bit more and decrease it in those wet conditions to try and maximize that contact patch and increase that mechanical grip when going through those turns. Obviously with this you can do a little bit of temperature control as well. For tracks when it's really quite hot, if you increase your camber angle, you're going to have less contact patch when going down the straights, which means that there'll be less friction across the surface of the tyre, and therefore it will allow the surface of the tyre to cool a little bit more on the straights as well. Obviously the inside leading edge is going to have a lot more pressure on it, and therefore it's going to increase the heat there across that inside third that's closest to the centre of the car. However, the middle third on the surface of the tyre and the outer third will probably be cooler and will provide a little bit more grip when it actually comes to the corners as well. So there's a number of different neat tricks that you can do with camber angles. Generally what I tend to do is aim for that 5 to 10 degrees spread from that inside third to the outside third that I mentioned earlier. And with that you also actually want to start taking a look at turning the symmetrical setup option off, so you can adjust the camber angles individually, because obviously not all tracks have the same number of corners that are same number of left-hand corners as the number of right-hand corners. So you'll want to set up your camber angles depending on the flow of the circuit. For example, Brands Hatch, where there's quite a lot of right-handed turns, you're going to be leaning on the left-hand tyre a lot more than you are on the right. Therefore you may want to have slightly more camber angle, say on the left, and possibly even reduce it slightly on the right side to make sure that you actually get that temperature spread across the surface of the tyre for all four tyres on the car. So it's not just about looking at the tyres as a whole, it's about looking at the tyres individually and adjusting your camber angles for that. Obviously it depends slightly from car to car. With the road cars, they'll have a lot less camber angle than your high-spec race cars. Obviously, when you go out towards the prototypes and also the high-end open wheelers, you'll probably find that you can get more camber angle than you can here in the GT3 cars. But aiming for that 5 to 10 degrees temperature difference across the surface of the tyre generally tends to work quite nicely. Do that across all sorts of different conditions. If you're on a track like Le Mans or Monza, it may be beneficial to reduce the camber angle. One thing I definitely don't recommend doing is reducing the camber angle on the rear down to its minimum and then keeping quite high camber angle at the front to try and maximize the grip in the corners, because what you'll have is really good cornering grip potential at the front. However, the rear tires won't be able to keep up with the front, and you'll get a lot of oversteer. Generally what you'll tend to find is that you'll turn into a corner, the front tyres will grip and bite quite nicely, but the rear tyres will become overloaded. They won't be able to keep up with the grip that the front tyres are producing, and they'll just give up, and the rear of the car will start to overtake the front. So you'll need to balance the front and rears a little bit, and also you obviously, like I said earlier, you'll need to adjust this in tuning with the anti-roll bars as well, as depending on what you have your anti-roll bar stiffness set to will affect how much the car actually leans onto the tyre, and you'll want to adjust your camber angle to try and maximize that contact patch through the corners. So that's what you want to be doing here with camber angles. It's obviously a little bit of a dark art. It takes a fair bit of time to adjust and tune effectively. Obviously, if you're making adjustments elsewhere, especially in terms of tire pressure, the spring rates, which we'll get to into a second, also your anti-roll bars, and then also if you start fiddling with the dampers as well, you may need to keep coming back to visit your camber angles and making sure you're adjusting and fine-tuning those. So it's something that you'll probably visit a number of times throughout the setup process, just like your tire pressures will be, and adjusting and constantly updating them. So they can be a little bit daunting, but they're also really quite powerful and very, very useful in trying to produce the mechanical grip and the cornering grip that you want going through the turns. And when you do get them set up right, the car does feel really, really nice, and it produces the grip that you're asking for when going through those turns. But yeah, like I said, with the wetter weather, where you're getting less loads through the corners, you may want to reduce the amount of camber angle that you put in to try and maximize the contact patch in those conditions as well. Now next up is the ride height, which is how high the car sits above the surface of the track. Now generally what you want to be aiming for here is the lower the car, the better. That will give you a lower center of gravity, which will increase your mechanical performance, and it will also increase the aerodynamic performance of the car as well. However, you are also increasing the chance of the car bottoming out, which will be detrimental to your acceleration and straight line speed. So with that in mind, for smoother tracks, you'll be able to get away with those lower ride heights, but for tracks that have quite big undulations, quite big bumps, various dips, divots, and also quite extreme camber angles and camber changes going through corners, such as the Nordschleife, it may be beneficial to actually increase the ride height a little bit to avoid the bottoming out, because when you bottom out through a corner, you're decreasing the traction on the wheels. They may not be making proper contact with the surface of the car, as it's actually the underside and the floor of the car that is making contact with the ground. It'll lift the tyres, you obviously break traction, it will then highly increase the chance of you spinning out. So you want to avoid bottoming out where possible. So adjust and tune your ride heights based on this, and with that as well, you also actually want to be careful and actually adjust your ride height and tune your ride height for when the car is in motion and traveling at higher speeds. Now the main reason for this is, as you increase speed, obviously air will flow over the surface of the car, and it will flow over the aerodynamic parts, which will produce downforce and push the car down towards the surface of the track. Now if you were to say have a very high rear downforce angle, and you were to have a very soft spring rate, what you'll find is that as you increase the speed, you'll get more airflow over the surface of the rear aero parts, and that'll push and create more downforce and push the rear of the car down towards the surface of the track. And rather than have the 83mm that is indicating here in the car setup, it may be a lot lower and be pushing the car further down. Obviously with that softer spring rate, there'll be less resistance to that downward push from the downforce, and it will therefore allow the rear of the car to be pushed down further. Whereas if I had a stiffer spring rate, there'll be more resistance, and it won't let the car's ride height change quite as dramatically. So you want to be careful when it comes to tuning your ride heights, and make sure that you're adjusting it for when the car is in motion, and taking note of the numbers in the way that I demonstrated back in the telemetry HUD view episode that I did. a few weeks ago. So if you haven't seen that, check that out, and you'll be able to see how you go about tuning the ride heights by taking a look at the height value and seeing what those values are when the car is in motion. Now, the values that you should actually be aiming for depend on the actual car itself. As it says in the help text, for cars that have sorry, if I bring the help text up, for the cars that have a flat bottom, i.e. a flat floor on the underside of the car, it's generally better to have a little bit more rake induced into the car. So with that, it means that having a lower front ride height and having a higher front ride height, and generally what that does is it sets the car more like a garden rake, as it were. So with that, you will obviously get better aero performance out of the car as well. However, for cars that have ground effect aerodynamic parts on the underside of the car, it's beneficial to have a more flat ride height, and it'll make use of those ground effect forces, accelerate the air through the underside of the car at a much faster rate and produce more downforce on the underside of the car, and that is where you'll get your mechanical grip. For the high performance aero cars, things like your high-end prototypes and your open wheelers, a lot of downforce actually comes from the underside of the car. So tuning your ride heights and getting those set up nicely and managing that airflow along the underside of the car will give you good aero performance, as well as obviously the downforce going over the top. So adjust the ride height values to what you're finding when the car is in motion. Obviously also adjust them depending on the actual downforce settings that you are setting here as well. Obviously with a lower downforce wing angles, you'll be able to get away with lower ride heights, as there'll be less aero push from the car pushing it down in towards the tarmac. Likewise, if you're having stiffer spring rates, you'll obviously have less resistance from the aerodynamics pushing, or shall I say the airflow pushing the car down towards the surface of the ground, and you'll be able to run with lower ride heights there as well. But it's all about keeping an eye on those values in the in that telemetry HUD view and adjusting them for when the car is at speed, and trying to maximize the performance out of the car as well. Obviously, if you go ahead and raise it up, you'll be increasing the drag at the rear of the car, which will help produce a little bit more downforce, but you're also actually increasing obviously the amount of travel that is available with the suspension. And raising it up a little bit too high, are you going too far with the rear ride height, will probably make the car feel quite soft and wallowy, and it'll move around and break traction a lot more. So you'll want to adjust this in conjunction with your spring rates as well, which we're actually going to come on to and move on to next. But yeah, you'll want to obviously fine tune those ride heights and basically adjust them and find what works right for the car, and obviously making sure that you're avoiding bottoming out the surface of the car when driving at high speed. So the next option, and the second to last in this episode, is the spring rate, and this affects the overall handling of the car and its overall responsiveness. If you stiffen up the springs, you're pushing the car more towards aerodynamic grip, whereas if you soften up the spring rates, you'll have more mechanical grip. And you kind of want to fine tune it based on what obviously the car actually prefers, to what you actually prefer, whether you prefer a car with more mechanical grip than aero grip, or vice versa. And also likewise towards the track as well. Tracks that are quite bumpy would be beneficial to have a softer spring rate, which will allow the car to take the bumps a little bit better and maintain the contact patch between the tyre and the track surface going over those bumps a little bit better, as well as obviously if you have a stiffer spring rate, you may find that the car will hop and bounce over those bumps a little bit, and obviously that will break traction. But with those softer springs on those bumpier circuits, you'll find that you'll probably need to increase the ride height as well, as we just discussed previously when having a look at the ride height settings. So spring rates are quite important. Obviously, for tracks that are smoother and flatter, you'll probably benefit from having the stiffer spring rates, as you'll get better aero performance, but also actually depends on the actual makeup of the track and how tight and twisty and the type of corners that it has. Obviously, if it has a lot of open flowing corners that benefit from the aerodynamic and the track doesn't have too many corners that are mechanical grip and slow speed based, you could probably get away with those stiffer spring rates as well. But like I said at the start, the spring rates will actually affect the overall balance of the car. So if you're finding that the car is oversteering through the mid corner and potentially on the exit, it may be beneficial to actually soften up the rear spring rates a little bit. That will induce a little bit more understeer and produce a little bit more mechanical grip. It will dial out some of that oversteer. Likewise, if you are finding that you are understeering, and especially if you're on a tighter and twistier circuit with sharp corners, which will require good front end responsiveness, you'll benefit from having a stiffer spring rate at the front and also stiffer spring rate at the rear. Obviously, that stiffer spring rate will give you that much sharper initial turn in bite, and also having it stiffer at the rear will help to rotate the car as well. So it's all about finding that balance for your own personal preference, also the actual track, like I said. Also with the weather conditions as well, it's pretty good to adjust the spring rates here too. Generally, obviously, you have lower grip in the wet conditions. What people tend to do is they go for an understeery based setup, which is obviously a lot safer, but it's also actually slower. If you put a little bit of oversteer into the rear, just a tiny amount, it helps to rotate the rear of the car around a little bit in those wet conditions, and it should help in getting those better lap times. Obviously, you don't want to go so far that the rear end is just snaking around and it doesn't have any grip at all, and you're oversteering and spinning out every time you turn into a corner. So it's all about that fine tuning and those fine adjustments. Obviously, like I said, you'll need to adjust your spring rates in conjunction with your ride height, also with the anti-roll bar as well, and also actually affects your camber angle, which then goes ahead and affects your tyre pressures. So when you're adjusting things like your spring rates, your ride heights, your camber angles, your anti-roll bars, you'll need to think about also your tyre pressures, the downforce settings that you're using, and also the dampers as well, and keeping an eye on those and making sure that you're doing little bits of fine-tuning adjustments for each of those, rather than just adjusting, say, just the spring rate in hope of solving any potential issues that you have. It may obviously improve the car handling in some areas, but it may also be detrimental in others. So try to think of the bigger picture when adjusting your spring rates, and take those into more accounts rather than adjusting on an individual basis. Obviously, cars such as the high downforce cars, you'll probably find that stiffer spring rates will work better, especially at the higher speed, more flowing circuits. And then, like I've been saying throughout the episode, for the slower speed corners and the twistier tracks, it may be beneficial to have a little bit more aerodynamic grip, depending on whether you're getting up to the speed to make use of any amount of downforce. So the last thing that we're going to touch base on in this episode is the track bar. As you can see, it can't be adjusted here on the BMW M6 GT3 car. For some of the American cars, such as the stock car, possibly also the Indy car as well, you may be able to adjust the track bar, or the panhard bar is what it is also alternatively named as. But effectively, what this is a bar that is connected from the chassis of the car to the rear axle, and adjusting the points at which those connect will affect basically how the cornering forces are transferred from the chassis down through into the tyres. So lowering those mounting points of the track or panhard bars will basically effectively tighten up the car and make it slightly more understeery, whereas if you go and raise it, it will make the car more oversteery, particularly if you raise it up on one side more so than the other. So for example, if I was to go ahead and raise the rear track bar on the right hand side of the car more than the left, going into left-handed turns, I'll have more oversteer when going into those left-handed turns than if I was going into the right, or having a lower rear right track bar setting. So in a way, it kind of works in a similar fashion to the anti-roll bars. Basically, the higher the trap bar, it will give you more rolling resistance, whereas a lower trap bar will opt as a softer anti-roll bar and give you more mechanical grip through that way. When it comes to racing on road courses, generally what you want to be doing is keeping the trap bars the same on both sides of the cars. When it comes to ovals and things like that, you could probably raise it slightly on one side to give you slightly better turn-in when going into those bank turns. But obviously don't raise it up so much that you get a ton of oversteer when you go into that corner, especially at some of the speeds that you get onto the ovals. It could be very detrimental and you could end up losing the rear of the car. It's not something that I've really come to grips with myself. I haven't really done too much oval running, if at all, apart from doing a little bit in the Indy cars, but I haven't really tested and adjusted the trap bars, so I haven't really got a good idea myself as to how they actually work. But hopefully that description there will give you some insight as to how the trap bar works, and hopefully this entire episode has actually helped you learn a bit more about suspension tuning as over an overall kind of thing. So yeah, make sure that when you're doing your adjustments to your suspension setup, that you're testing them with the telemetry HUD view and making sure that the values are coming out looking good there in terms of your ride height. You're not bottoming the car out, you're also getting good temperature spread across the width of the tyre, and generally the car is behaving in a much more expected and predictable manner, and in the way that you would like it to. So if you would like a little bit of oversteer, stiffen up the rear of the car a little bit more. Likewise, if you want a little bit more understeer, it may be worth softening the rear of the car a little bit more, and that will give you that safer rear of the car and give you better traction. So yeah, it's all about balance with the suspension. So hopefully this episode has been useful to you guys in adjusting your suspension for your tuning setups. If you have any comments or questions, feel free to leave them down in the comments section below. I should try and get back to you as soon as possible. If you've been enjoying these Insider Guide episodes, please consider subscribing to the channel as well. Obviously, I very much appreciate it if you guys like the video and share it and pass the knowledge on to others as well to help them with their tuning setups. But otherwise, thank you very much for watching, guys. Hopefully I shall catch you in the next episode, but until then, in the meantime, take care.